I'm a senior anthropology student at Everbrook College, known mostly for its historical archives and the occasional ghost story whispered in dorm rooms. For my thesis, I'd chosen to dive into local legends, the kind that didn't make it to the textbooks. My advisor suggested the town's forgotten cemetery, what locals called Hollow Hill. It was a place swallowed by trees and shadow, abandoned for reasons no one could quite explain. The journey to Hollow Hill took me deep into the woods, guided by an old map photocopied from the archives. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the late autumn air felt heavier the closer I got. When I finally found the cemetery, it was like stepping back in time, leaning headstones half buried in moss, trees with roots thick as coffins, and an oppressive silence that clung to everything. I started photographing the gravestones, jotting down their worn names and dates. Then I came across it, an unmarked grave, little more than a patch of uneven earth surrounded by crumbled stones. Something about it felt wrong. I told myself it was just the oddity of finding an unmarked site here, among so many named ones. I knelt and brushed aside the leaves, uncovering a small rusted locket, half buried in the soil. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a young woman. Her eyes were sharp, almost accusatory. I hesitated but tucked it into my pocket, thinking it could be a clue for my research. As I walked back to my car, the woods seemed darker than before. Shadows stretched too far, and the silence became unbearable, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, a flash of white, like fabric, disappearing between the trees. I quickened my pace, my pulse hammering. When I finally reached my car, it felt like a sanctuary. But as I drove away, the rearview mirror showed the woods stretching behind me, darker and emptier than they had any right to be. I dismissed the unease, chalking it up to nerves and overwork. But later that night, as I placed the locket on my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd taken more than a piece of history. That night, sleep was elusive. The locket sat on my desk, gleaming faintly in the moonlight spilling through my dorm window. I felt ridiculous being so fixated on it, but something about that woman's face, her piercing, almost resentful gaze, burrowed into my mind. Around 3 a.m., I drifted into a fitful sleep. At first, I dreamed of the woods, the sound of brittle leaves crunching beneath unseen footsteps, the whistle of wind through the trees. Then it shifted. I was standing in a cold, damp room. The stone walls were streaked with black mold, and faint whispers tickled my ears, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the corner, her back to me. She wore a long, tattered dress, the kind you'd expect from a century ago, its fabric stained and torn. Her head was tilted unnaturally, as if her neck had snapped. My mouth went dry as I tried to move, to call out, but I was rooted in place. She turned. Slowly. Her face was pale and hollowed, with eyes that burned white-hot, devoid of life yet impossibly alive. "Why did you take it?" she whispered, her voice sharp and brittle like glass breaking. I jolted awake, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. The room was stifling, yet the air felt icy against my skin. My desk lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room. My eyes darted to the locket, it was no longer on my desk. Before panic could set in, I spotted it on the floor, lying open. The woman's face stared up at me, but something was different. The eyes, they weren't painted anymore. They were sharp, vivid, almost human. And they were looking right at me. I backed away, tripping over my chair, and fell hard onto the floor. For a moment, I lay there, paralyzed by fear. But nothing else happened. No whispers. No shadowy figures. Just silence. I told myself I was imagining things, that I must have knocked the locket off the desk in my sleep. But as I crawled back into bed, the sensation of being watched lingered. Sleep didn't come again. The next day, I threw myself into research to keep my mind off the night's events. I spent hours poring over records in the campus library, trying to find any mention of Hollow Hill or unmarked graves in the area. What I found only made the creeping dread worse. In 1893, a young woman named Eleanor Wilde was accused of witchcraft after several townspeople fell ill and livestock began to die mysteriously. Though there was no trial, townsfolk took justice into their own hands. Her body was never buried in the town cemetery. Instead, it was rumored that her killers dragged her deep into the woods, dumping her in an unmarked grave. Hollow Hill. My hands trembled as I closed the book. I felt a chill settle over me, as if the library itself had grown colder. Eleanor Wilde. Could that be her in the locket? And if so, why had she been buried with it? I pushed the questions away, determined to stay logical. But that night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. A figure stood behind me, her hollowed face half hidden in the shadows. I spun around so fast that I nearly toppled over, but the room was empty. My heart thundered as I scanned every corner, even under the bed, like a child afraid of monsters. Nothing. Just the eerie stillness of my dorm room. But the mirror was a different story. The reflection was wrong. In the glass, my bed looked disheveled even though I'd just made it. My desk chair was turned toward me, though it hadn't been. The locket, now back on the desk, sat open, the woman's face distorted and grinning. I stepped closer to the mirror, hesitant, every muscle screaming for me to look away. When I was close enough to see my breath fogging the glass, a new detail caught my eye, dark handprints smeared across the edges of the frame. The smudges looked wet. Behind me, faint whispers began to rise. It was a cascade of voices, overlapping, incoherent at first. Then, through the chaos, one voice broke through, a low, hissing whisper that chilled me to my core. Give it back. The locket snapped shut on its own, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. The whispers cut off, plunging the room into oppressive silence. I stumbled backward, knocking into my chair and gripping its edge for stability. My breaths came in ragged gasps, but I refused to scream. If I screamed, I'd be acknowledging that this was real. The locket was still on the desk, but now its clasp gleamed as if freshly polished. I didn't dare touch it. Instead, I grabbed my coat and bolted out the door, determined to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever this was. I found myself at the campus chapel, one of the oldest buildings in Everbrook. Its heavy oak doors groaned as I pushed them open, revealing an interior shrouded in dim light. Empty pews stretched before me, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax. I didn't know why I'd come here, maybe I was desperate for some kind of sanctuary. I sat in the second row, gripping the back of the pew in front of me as though it might anchor me. My mind raced with questions. Was Eleanor Wilde haunting me? Was this some elaborate trick of my overworked imagination? And, most pressing of all, what did she want? Give it back. The voice hissed from somewhere nearby, clear as day. My blood ran cold. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I might see. At the far end of the chapel, a shadow shifted. It was taller than any human, impossibly thin, and it moved with an unnatural grace. It didn't approach me directly but seemed to slither along the edges of the room, its presence heavy and oppressive. I gripped the pew tighter, my nails digging into the worn wood. The shadow began to take shape, a woman with a broken neck, her head lolling unnaturally to one side. It was her. Eleanor Wilde. You disturbed my rest, she whispered, her voice echoing in the cavernous chapel. You took what was mine. I opened my mouth to reply, but no sound came out. My throat felt constricted, as if icy fingers had wrapped around it. The shadow moved closer, her translucent form becoming more defined with each step. Her eyes burned with a fierce, unnatural light, and her face contorted in fury. You must return it, or the debt will be paid in blood, she said. Her voice grew louder with each word, rattling the stained glass windows. Your blood. I finally found my voice and stammered, I didn't know, I didn't mean to. You knew enough to take it, she spat, her form flickering like a dying flame. Do not test me, child. Return it. Or suffer. Before I could react, she lunged. Her shadowy hands reached for me, and the world around me shattered into darkness. When I woke, I was back in my dorm room, sprawled on the floor. My head throbbed, and my skin felt clammy. The chapel had vanished, but the oppressive cold remained. The locket lay in the middle of the room, its clasp snapped open again. The woman's face stared at me, no longer a portrait. Her features were real, alive, her lips twisting into a silent scream. I scrambled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air in the room grew heavy, the shadows in the corners deepening. From the mirror, her voice slithered out, a low, venomous growl, you have until the next moonrise. A terrible thought struck me, I didn't know what she meant. Was she warning me? Threatening me? Or had I already run out of time? I spent the day in a frantic haze, poring over every scrap of information I could find about Eleanor Wilde. But the deeper I dug, the more horrific the details became. According to one obscure record, her accusers hadn't simply killed her. They had tortured her, forcing her to confess to crimes she never committed. She cursed them with her final breath. It wasn't just her grave I'd disturbed. It was her sanctuary, her one place of peace. And I'd taken from it without thought. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air in my dorm thickened again. The locket, still untouched on my desk, began to rattle violently. The noise was deafening, filling my head with a cacophony of whispers, screams, and pleading cries. Then the locket flung itself open. A sharp, bone-chilling wind erupted from it, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. The air churned, and a figure began to materialize in the center of the room. It was her. Eleanor. Fully formed now, her hollow eyes boring into me. Her head tilted sharply, her broken neck producing a sickening crack. Her dress billowed as if caught in an invisible storm, and her feet hovered inches above the floor. You did not heed my warning, she hissed. Her voice was a symphony of rage, grief, and vengeance. Now I will take what is owed. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My limbs were leaden, my body frozen in place as Eleanor's shadow stretched toward me. Her hand shot forward, cold and insubstantial, piercing into my chest. Pain. Blinding, searing pain. It felt like she was reaching for my very soul, tearing it from my body thread by thread. My vision blurred, and I felt my consciousness slipping. Wait. I choked out, finding just enough strength to speak. I'll fix it. I'll return it. Please. Her hand stopped, inches from my heart. For a moment, the room was still. Her head tilted, and the corners of her mouth twitched, curling into something between a snarl and a smile. You cannot undo what has been done, she said. But you may yet appease me. Take me to where they burned me. Tell the world my truth. Her form flickered, her voice growing distant. If you fail, your blood will be mine. And just like that, she was gone. The room fell silent, the locket clattering to the floor. My chest ached as though a vice had been wrapped around my ribs, and I gasped for air. The shadows in the room remained, clinging to the walls like living things. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing what awaited me if I failed? By dawn, I had a plan. Desperation fueled me as I gathered my things, a flashlight, my phone, and a spade. I had to go back to Hollow Hill. Eleanor's final demand echoed in my mind, take me to where they burned me. I wasn't sure how to find the place, but I prayed the answers would come. The forest was colder than before, the morning sun doing little to pierce the dense canopy. The map in my hand trembled as I made my way to the cemetery. This time, the woods felt different, alive. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and every shadow seemed to move just beyond the edge of my vision. When I reached the unmarked grave, I stood there for what felt like an eternity. I didn't want to touch the soil again, but I knew I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I sank the spade into the earth, the sound of metal on dirt loud in the oppressive silence. Each scoop sent chills down my spine, as though the ground itself was protesting. Finally, I hit something hard. A wooden box, blackened and brittle with age. I lifted it carefully, and as I did, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. The box creaked as I opened it, revealing Eleanor's charred remains wrapped in a decaying shroud. The locket lay nestled among the ashes. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. Then came her voice, carried on the wind, "Take me." Following the vague historical accounts I'd found, I set off deeper into the woods, carrying the box in my trembling hands. The path twisted unnaturally, the trees closing in around me. The forest seemed endless, time losing all meaning as I trudged forward. And then I saw it. A clearing bathed in an eerie light, its edges ringed with blackened stones. The ground was scorched, the soil brittle and lifeless. This had to be the place. The site where Eleanor Wilde was burned alive. As I stepped into the clearing, a deafening crack of thunder split the air, though the sky was clear. The box in my hands grew unbearably cold, and I stumbled, nearly dropping it. "You've come," her voice hissed, "closer now." I placed the box in the center of the clearing and opened it. The moment I did, the air around me grew heavy, pressing against my chest. The shadows lengthened, converging on the box, swirling like a black storm. Eleanor's form emerged, her face twisted in pain and rage. She hovered over the box, her broken body outlined by a fiery glow. For a moment, I thought I'd fulfilled her demand, that this nightmare was finally over. But then her eyes turned to me. "You've returned my remains," she said, her voice cold and sharp. But my truth must still be told. Before I could ask what she meant, the shadows surged forward, enveloping me. My vision went black, and my body felt weightless. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in a different clearing. But it wasn't empty. A group of people stood around me, their faces contorted with fear and anger. Their clothes were old-fashioned, their voices rising in hateful shouts. I realized I was no longer myself. I was her, Eleanor Wilde. They dragged me to the center of the clearing, binding me to a stake. My body fought against the ropes, but their grip was unyielding. A priest chanted as they piled kindling at my feet, his voice trembling with false righteousness. "Witch," someone spat. "You'll burn for your sins." The fire roared to life, and the heat was unbearable. My screams filled the air as flames licked at my skin, the pain beyond anything I'd imagined. The world blurred, the faces of my tormentors fading into darkness. But one thing remained clear, my rage. I gasped, jolted back to the present. The clearing was empty now, save for the blackened box at my feet. Eleanor's voice echoed in my mind, faint and hollow. "They must know what they did. Write it. Speak it. Spread it, or I will take you as they took me." When I stumbled out of the woods hours later, I was a shell of myself. Her pain, her fury, it was all burned into me, as real as my own memories. I returned to campus and locked myself in my dorm, where I began to write her story. Every detail, every injustice. I wrote until my fingers ached, my heart racing with the urgency of her demand. When I finally fell asleep at my desk, I dreamed of Eleanor one last time. She stood at the edge of the woods, her figure faint and flickering like a dying ember. Her expression wasn't angry anymore, it was almost peaceful. When I woke, the locket was gone. But the whispers remain. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I swear I hear her voice. "Keep going. They must know."